Well, this morning, we're starting a 6-week sermon series on the vision for the next chapter of Wellspring. And I wanted to start this series with the parable of the talents because the parable of the talents was instrumental in many of our thinking as we considered starting Wellspring Family Church. So 4.5 years ago, we were thinking about this parable. Would it be a better use of our resources to start this church? So before we talk about the next chapter of Wellspring, I want to take you all the way back to the origin of Wellspring. For more than 25 years, there were 2 evangelical free churches within 5 miles of one another. One was called Cornerstone in Webster Groves. One was Christ Community in South County. And Jesus had entrusted these churches with resources, and both churches had been faithful about investing those resources for his kingdom. But both churches had dreams of seeing even more fruit for God's kingdom and more impact for God's kingdom. And Wellspring Family Church was born out of a desire to better realize those dreams. We wanted to maximize the resources that God gave us because we knew our time here on earth is short. And we've been working really hard to try to do this for the last 3.5 years. Most of us have never started a church before, but we're working really hard at this. And have we done everything perfectly? No, we haven't. But there is a resilience here at Wellspring that I am so proud of. There's a willingness to work hard at things. There's a willingness to stay late during an elder meeting, maybe well past midnight, just to continue to hash things out as we seek the Lord's direction. Some of the things that we've worked through and are working through as a church are painful and difficult, but we're learning to be a church that's a family. And to me, that's worth it. That's worth it. And something else that I'm so proud of is that there is a lot of love for one another here at Wellspring. And I hear this all the time. I hear this from visitors even, that I was greeted. I visited 5 churches and nobody said hi, but I came here and 3 different people came up and introduced themselves. I love that. There's love and there's understanding. We know that we're all sinful. We're trying to do this thing called church as sinful, fallen human beings, and we fall short. And without love, there would be no family. So I'm very proud of that. And through all the learning and trying and figuring things out, I truly believe that God's hand of blessing is on Wellspring Family Church in a very special way. And I feel that every day. In a very short time, we are seeing exactly what we dreamed of 3.5 years ago. We are having greater impact for Christ and his kingdom than we were before. We still have a lot to work on. We have a long way to go. But I am confident because the same God that has been with us up to this point promises to continue to be with us into the future. Without that promise, we couldn't do this. But God is with us. God is more committed to Wellspring than we are. He's so excited for us. So he's excited about our future. And we need to remember that the story of Wellspring is a story that Jesus is just starting to write. We're just in the early chapters, right? So to help us to prepare for the next chapter, we're going to look at the parable of the talents. This is also a way to kind of tie our parable series into our vision series that we're leading into. So the basic idea in this parable is that God distributes great resources to his people and calls them to aggressively invest those resources to advance his kingdom. The parable of the talents follows immediately after the parable of the 10 virgins that Jeff preached on last week. And Jeff did such a great job in that sermon. There was a lot of things I really appreciated. And one of them was how Jeff set the context for Jesus' teaching in Matthew 25. And we saw that the parable of the 10 virgins and the parable of the talents are part of the same teaching of Jesus that goes back to Matthew chapter 24. Jesus is talking about his return at the end of the age, and he emphasizes that nobody knows the hour of his return. And when Jesus says nobody knows, he really means nobody knows. No one knows, he says. Not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. Now, I don't know why the Father chose to conceal the timing of his return from his Son, but the Bible tells us very clearly why God hides this information from us. And our denomination has a great statement about this. The coming of Christ at a time known only to God demands constant expectancy, which motivates the believer to godly living, sacrificial service, and energetic mission. This is what Jesus was talking about in Matthew 24. One day the master will return, so we must serve God faithfully, because blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. We want to be those servants. The parable of the 10 virgins emphasizes the importance of being ready for the master's return. The parable of the talents emphasizes what being ready looks like. And we'll miss a lot of what Jesus is saying if we don't understand that these are part of one teaching. So we ended last week with these words, "Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." And immediately, in the same teaching, in probably the same breath, Jesus says, "For it will be like a man going on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted to them his property." So in the parable, the man going on the journey is Jesus. We are the servants. And the property that he has entrusted to us is all the gifts, all the abilities, all the resources that Jesus has given to his people. If you think about just Wellspring, you realize that Jesus has given so many gifts and abilities to his church. It all belongs to the Master, and it's all on loan to us so that our stewardship of those resources would be for him. It's to use for his purposes. So the master has entrusted to them, to the servants, his property. Now, in our context as a church, especially as we're preparing to enter a facility project, it's appropriate that one aspect of his property really is our building and property, because God quite literally has entrusted property to us. And every single square inch of our 4.1 acres of land is 100% his property. And we want to maximize the use of it as a tool for the Lord and for the advancement of his kingdom. That's all we're trying to do with a facility project. But I want to make it very clear that our 4.1 acres of property and our building that we have here on the ground is just one of many of the resources that he has given us. That's just one. In the next chapter of Wellspring, we want to continue learning and growing and being better at maximizing the use of all the resources that the Master has given to us. And this includes our building and property. And we'll be talking about that just a little bit in the next couple of months ahead. but Jesus has given us many resources, and we'll be talking about that as well. Most of them come to individuals, and they're offered to us for his service. Jesus says, to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Now, Bible commentators from the first century church fathers all the way up to today have agreed that this parable of the talents needs to be interpreted in terms of all the resources that God has given to us. Not just our money, our time, our abilities. But the word talent actually was a Greek monetary term, and I think Jesus chose a monetary image because he wants us to understand that the gifts that he gives us are resources that we are supposed to invest in his kingdom to earn a return. So he chose this image, and he chose a talent because a talent represents a lot of money. Dr. Dan Doriani was our family camp speaker a couple of years ago, if you remember, in 2021. And he wrote a great commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. And in that commentary, he said, the purchasing power of 1 talent was 6,000 denarii, the equivalent of 20 years' wages for an ordinary laborer. 20 years' wages? That's 1 talent. He gave 5 talents also, right? That's 100 years of wages for a laborer. And that's just if you're assuming a silver talent. So talents actually had to do with the weight of the coin and not the material of the coin. The value of a gold talent was way more than the value of a silver talent. But the obvious point that Jesus is making here is that he has distributed resources to his people extravagantly. He has given extravagantly, and he wants his servants to know that. There is zero concern that God may not have given enough resources for his people to do what he has called them to do. There's no concern about that. And God has called us to do a lot of things as a church. He's called us to a ministry to the homeless. He's called us to a ministry to children and youth and the next generation. He's called us to help with ministry in Dutchtown, in Uganda, and lots of other things. But there is no shortage of resources from his side. The only question is whether we will choose to invest those resources in his kingdom or bury them in the ground, as we heard in the parable. God has called Wellspring to a big vision, and he has abundantly supplied everything that we need. And if you just look back for the first 3.5 years, we've seen that over and over again, haven't we? The story of Wellspring has been a story of God supplying, God providing, God getting us through a difficult time here, a challenge over there, God bringing people just when we need them. And I'm looking forward to the next chapter of Wellspring because that's been the pattern. One thing we know for sure is out of his abundant resources, the master will continue to give all that his servants need to accomplish his purposes. And something else we know for sure here in the parable is that the master doesn't do the work for us. He gives us talents, and he gives us great freedom on how we use those talents. But right after he distributes the talents, the parable says, then he went away. He went away. And from the time that Jesus went away, because remember, Jesus is the master in the parable. From the time that Jesus went away in Acts chapter 1 until his return at the end of time, he expects us to be good stewards of the extravagant resources that he has given us. It's a big responsibility. And it might be easy to think, well, I just want life to be a little simpler than that. That's a lot of responsibility, but it's a shared responsibility. And I'm glad that Jesus has given us so many resources as a church. Because that means he trusts us to do his work for his kingdom. And so he's calling us to more. And that's what the two faithful servants did in the parable. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. Both of the faithful servants aggressively invested the master's resources, and they doubled them. They doubled the return. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. So during this sermon series for the next 6 weeks, and then for the following sermon series leading up to Thanksgiving, we're going to send you home with questions each week. So these questions are designed just to help you have a conversation about the things that we've been talking about at church. So maybe you go out to lunch with somebody after church, or you get together with your family or friends or at small group. You can take these questions, and these can be conversation starters just for going a little deeper on the things that we're learning. I just want to read you 2 of the questions here, just to kind of give you an idea. Question 6 says, in the parable, God praised the first 2 servants for being faithful over a few things, faithfully investing the talents they were given. What would it look like for us, both individually or as a group, to invest our talents faithfully and receive similar praise? So that's a question you can talk about and explore together. Question number 10. Why did the 3rd servant not invest his talent? What was he afraid of? What would that kind of fear look like in our lives, both individually and as a family or small group? So these are the kinds of questions that you'll be able to explore and go deeper on as you think about this. And we want to equip you just for the next several weeks with how to do that. So as you leave today, you'll be given one of these handouts. But as you think about that, I want you to notice that each time Jesus gives talents to his people, it says, he who had received the 5 talents or the 2 talents or the 1 talent. Each one of us has received from Jesus. Not just money and resources, but that's part of it. But the time that we have, the time that we can invest in his work, the gifts and talents that you have been given, the relationships, the experiences that you have had, so much goes in to what God has given you. All of it comes or is worked through to work out through his generous hand. And it's not just for you. He gives talents, he gives gifts, but those are meant to be invested back in his kingdom. And you'll never understand your purpose in God's kingdom until you understand that the reason you have been given gifts, the reason 1 Corinthians talks about gifts for every believer, is so that you can give back in his name. You've been given incredible gifts. And I know some of you struggle to believe this because I talk to you and I hear you're thinking about this. But you yourself are also a precious gift of God to the world. You are a precious gift. And God has designed you that you are to bring yourself to worship together with one another. Bring yourself to serving and using your gifts to serve in the church and in his kingdom. In 1 Peter it says, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house. See, there is no house unless there's a bunch of stones coming together. I've never seen a house of one stone, right? That's the image. All these living stones coming together and building something beautiful that we can't do alone. That's this beautiful image of the church. And Jesus intentionally designed his church to only work if all the parts come together working as one. That's why the New Testament talks about the church as a body and starts listing all these parts of the body, because the body doesn't work unless all the parts are connected and working together. That's the church. So I don't care how gifted you are. You can't just go off and do your gifts and serve God separated from the body of Christ. You were not designed to do that. So at Wellspring, we're learning how to do that. We're growing in how to do that. But our vision is to be a church that's a family on mission. A family together, serving in God's mission for us. And you can't fulfill your part of God's mission on your own. One of the things that we do every summer at King's Kids Camp is we have this activity we call group initiatives. So in group initiatives, you take all your campers and you've got to get them there, and there's a wall that's 10 feet high, and the campers have to all get over that wall to the other side. And there's no way they can do it unless they work together, because nobody can jump up and grab the top of that wall. And even if one person can, there's no way the whole group can. There's no way fourth graders can anyway. But working together, they can do this incredible thing. And God has designed his church like that. Working together, we multiply our gifts, and we can see his hand come in with us and do things that just are not possible on our own. So Wellspring is about all of us pooling together our gifts and talents and resources and serving God together as a family on mission in everything that we do. And each of you is an essential part of the functioning of the church. And if you lose sight of that, then you'll only come to church maybe out of habit or maybe as a consumer of religious goods. But we are not made to be consumers. We are made to be contributors. And I know that, like I said, that's a struggle for some of you because you just don't see yourself that way. You don't see yourself maybe the way the Father sees you. So I just want to emphasize with you that you are handcrafted by God to be a valuable, important, necessary, contributing part of the body of Christ. That's who you are. I was trying to think of an illustration for this, so for some reason I thought of just the world of art, and I Googled most valuable works of art in the world. So if you do a Google search, Michelangelo's statue of David comes up very quickly on most lists. So Michelangelo was an amazing artist. And for 3 years, he hand-carved every detail of this statue to produce this incredible work of art. But each and every human being is infinitely more valuable than the statue of David. This statue is not alive. This statue was created by a human being, but you were created by the one who created Michelangelo. You have physical parts of your body that are 1,000,000 times more complex than any physical part of a statue. You have parts on the inside of you that the statue doesn't have. And way beyond all your physical parts, at your core, you are a spiritual being. who has a body, but who at core is spiritual. And because that part of you is non-physical, your soul, we can't observe it with a microscope, and we can't put it up on the screen. I tried to Google picture of soul, and it didn't really work. But the spiritual part of you, if you could see it, if you could see what God sees, the spiritual part of you is infinitely more complex than the physical part of you. Infinitely more valuable. No computer or AI, not even ChatGPT, 1,000 years from now will have the capability of a human being created in the image of God. Artificial intelligence will always be artificial. AI will never be alive. It will never be conscious. It will never have a mental life. At least not until a computer programmer learns how to make a soul and stick that into the program. I don't think that's going to happen. The Bible really knows what it's talking about when it says, you are fearfully and wonderfully made. You. And because you are a spiritual being and not just a physical being, you will live forever. A marble statue will live a long time, or will be around a long time. It won't live. It may be around 1,000 years or 10,000 years. But eventually, even the statue of David will be dust. But every human being, even the smallest, tiniest, most vulnerable human being, will be alive 100,000 years from now. You are so special, so valuable to God. And I think if there's one thing that I could get you to believe, it would be that. Because so much flows out of your understanding of your identity. You are so special. When we were planning this series, one of the beautiful ideas that came out of a planning meeting was that every single human being is a 5-talent person. So when you came in today, you should have been handed a jar like this with a little Sharpie in it. Did you get that? If you didn't, you can get one on your way out. We've got them on the way out. But pick one of these up on your way out, one per household, okay? One per household. But also, you'll be given a little bag like this. And in this bag, we have 5 talents. Not really. This is not 100 years worth of wages. These are little wooden coins. If they were, we would have our building project all done, right? These are little wooden coins that says next on one side, it's blank on the other side. So what we want you to do is we want you to take these, and over the next few days, few weeks, few months, we want you to take these, and we want you to really give serious thought to what gifts and talents God has given you. What abilities has He given you? What resources has He given you? And we want you just to write that on the back. It's probably just going to be 1 or 2 words. Just write it on the back and then put it in the jar and keep that somewhere visible in your home. Put that on a counter or on a table or somewhere where you see it. And talk about it and have discussions about it. And don't do this alone. Get together with a friend, get together with your family, and encourage one another. And we want to write down these gifts and talents just to help us to consider who God has made us to be. And then at the end of this series, right before Thanksgiving, we're going to come back, we're going to bring these, and we're going to pour these out somehow up here. We haven't even decided yet. Somehow, just as an offering to God, we're going to be offering our gifts, talents, just symbolically here to show that. So we're working on that idea. But what you need to do is take one per person, a bag, and work on that in the days to come. I think you're actually going to have a lot of fun with that, and I think it's going to be a helpful process just to understand yourself. The Creator has created you to be a one-of-a-kind, handcrafted work of art. And we want this exercise to help you to understand that better. So you matter to Him, you matter to the church, and you are way more valuable than even 5 talents of gold. All right? You're a precious member of His family, and you have an eternal destiny in God's universe. And, by the way, He calls you, and He calls me, and He calls us together as a church to reach other people who also have an eternal destiny in God's universe, especially the most vulnerable of our world, which is really at the heart of Wellspring. So that's why Jesus expects faithful stewardship from His church. He doesn't lavish all these resources on us for no reason. He expects us to be faithful, to use them, and He will return for an evaluation. Verse 19. Now, after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. When the master comes to settle accounts, I want to be in the position of those first 2 servants. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here I have made 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also who had 2 talents came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here, I have made 2 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. The faithful servants received 3 great rewards, and all 3 of these are worth giving our lives for. And by the way, none of these rewards are things that we have to wait until we get to heaven to receive. All of these are rewards that we can begin to experience right now, even as we will experience the full reward someday. Reward number 1. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. I want to live my life in such a way as to hear those words when I'm greeted by the master. Those words would be enough. Nothing else. Those would be enough. But he has 2 more rewards for us. Reward number 2. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. The master says to these 2 servants, You have been faithful. You have been faithful in what I have given you. I am going to give you more. I feel like that's the story of Wellspring. That's why I started with 2 churches who had been faithful, and God says, I want to give you more. What a blessing it is to be trusted by God. And this last one is one that I've been thinking about a lot lately. Reward number 3, enter into the joy of your master. This world is filled with so much sin and pain and heartache, but in God's kingdom is unspeakable joy. And sometimes I think in just the busyness of our lives, even in the busyness of serving Him, we end up carrying burdens that are not ours to carry, but they are His to carry. And when we do that, we feel very little joy. And after being a Christian for 40 years now, I'm still trying to learn how to give those cares and concerns over to the Lord and not carry them all on my own shoulders. And it's a struggle. But he wants us to live in joy now. And at the end of the journey, Jesus has promised eternal joy, the joy of the Master. Now, I think these are rewards worth giving our lives to, right? 3 rewards for a life of faithfulness. Well, that's what awaits the faithful servants. And that would be a beautiful ending to the parable, except Jesus has a little bit more to say. So we can't leave the parable until we also hear the words of warning to the unfaithful servant, which Jesus closes the parable with. The unfaithful servant did not invest his talents in God's kingdom, but hid them in the ground. Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. This servant is unfaithful, and he's judged for his actions, but his actions follow a heart that totally misunderstood the heart of the master. He thinks the master was a hard man, and he says, I was afraid of you. So this is someone who doesn't know God at all, completely misunderstands who God is. I was afraid. So I went and hid your talent in the ground. In his fear and in his attempt to avoid making a mistake, he made the biggest mistake of all. He completely missed in sharing what his master was doing. He missed out on the privilege of sharing in the work of the master. And so he fell under God's judgment. You wicked and slothful servant. Those are kind of hard words, aren't they? Jesus doesn't really beat around the bush. Then the master said, take the talent from him and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. The Bible commentator Leon Morris says Jesus is giving us a principle of the spiritual life. Anyone who has a talent of any kind and fails to use it, by that very fact, forfeits it. That's what Jesus is saying. And then the master pronounces judgment on the unbelieving servant and casts the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So this is a picture of eternal judgment on the person who so misunderstands the heart of God, which according to Jesus is the only reason anyone would choose not to invest their talents fully in his kingdom. That's the only reason. If you're not wanting to do that, it's because you just totally missed God altogether. The unfaithful servant is one who has chosen to live outside and separate from God's kingdom. This man is oblivious to the fact that he will have to settle accounts with the master someday. Until that day comes. And he was not prepared. So that's the parable of the talents. The next chapter of Wellspring will be defined by how we invest the extravagant resources that God has poured out on our church. For the faithful servant, there is great reward. But there's warning for the unfaithful servant. I want to live my life in such a way as to receive those rewards along the way and especially at the end of the journey. I want to hear those words, "Well done, good and faithful servant." I want Wellspring to hear those words. So let's take the gifts and the talents and the resources and the things that God has given us, and let's invest them back in his kingdom as an outpouring of our love for him. That will be the next chapter of Wellspring. Let's pray together. Father God, you have lavished your blessing upon us far greater than we deserve. And you have invited us to invest in the precious lives of human beings. And that's why we do all the various ministries that we do here at the church. That's why we're talking about a building campaign. We want to use every resource that you have given us as an investment in your kingdom. Thank you for entrusting us with so much, and help us to respond by faith. Amen.